Melbourne is a city that loves its hot beverages, more specifically coffee. Around the country and the world, we're known as a place of coffee drinkers and appreciators. The usual explanation for this refers to the migration of Italians and Greeks into Victoria after the Second World War, and the resulting huge influence on our food and drink. But this is only part of the story, because well before the mid-20th century, coffee already had a firm foothold in colonial Melbourne from even before Federation. This is because of the temperance movement, which had a huge influence on many aspects of life at the time, and is a social phenomenon that we've talked about before. For another example of how they influenced our history, check out this video on drinking fountains in the top right-hand corner. The first society was formed in Australia in 1837. They rapidly increased in number, with many thousands of people joining. These groups included the Independent Order of Rechabites and the Women's Christian Temperance Union, some branches of which are still around today. In their never-ending quest against the dreaded liquor, they employed many different strategies. One of these was to replace pubs. They wanted to do this by providing a setting that had the same social and other experiences as pubs, but just without the alcohol. And this is where coffee comes into the picture. Shops that served coffee had taken off in Europe throughout the 18th century, especially France and the UK, after the drink was popularised in the 1600s. These coffee houses were set out as attractive, relaxing lounges, where anyone could come in and catch up on the latest news, discuss current events, and meet people. Just like cafes today, they usually served other drinks and small meals as well. As these flourished, the idea of creating grander structures to more directly compete with pubs and hotels came into being. The first versions of these larger buildings were called temperance hotels and spread just as rapidly as the initial coffee houses in Europe. Like many things at the time, these quickly came into Australia from the UK, and what sparked the idea to create one of the most iconic and elaborate buildings to ever be built in Melbourne, coffee palaces. These were a step further than coffee houses. They wanted to be grand and ornate buildings for people to come and enjoy themselves, not only to drink coffee, but also to eat, sleep, read, play billiards, and many other things. The first establishment that came close to what was later referred to as a coffee palace in Melbourne was opened by John Tankard in 1849, called Tankard's Temperance Hotel, on Lonsdale Street's south side between William Street and Queen Street. But this was far from the elaborate structures that were soon to come. Soon after the first alcohol-free hotels opened, the Victorian gold rush in 1951 changed everything. The temperance movement watched in horror as liquor ran rife throughout the colony, and they felt the need to respond. Luckily for them, international investment opportunities were among the many other things that the gold rush brought into Melbourne. This spurred on rapid construction and conversion of coffee palaces and temperance hotels right across the city. By 1888, over 50 coffee palaces had been built in Melbourne. This was partly due to the rapid population expansion and investment, but also because the temperance movement had been successfully growing in both numbers and influence. Alcohol restrictions had become mainstream political thought, and many influential citizens joined their ranks. These included people such as James Monroe, a local politician and property investor. Among other things, he is known for purchasing what is today called the Windsor Hotel in 1886. He renamed it to the Grand Coffee Palace and ceremoniously burned the liquor license on its steps, famously pledging never to serve alcohol within its walls. Monroe was also responsible for building new, dedicated coffee palaces across the city. These included the famous Victoria Coffee Palace on Collins Street, although many others, such as the first Coffee Palace in Melbourne, the Collingwood Coffee Palace on Smith Street, preceded it by several years. But arguably the most famous and grandest of them all, in Melbourne at least if not in Australia, was the Federal Coffee Palace on the southwest corner of Collins Street and King Street. Built in 1888 to coincide with a centennial exhibition, this 7-storey building aimed to impress from both the inside and out. It featured 370 bedrooms, dining rooms, smoking areas, reading rooms, lounges, and every possible modern convenience, including gas lighting, electric service bells, and 3 passenger lifts. The outside was designed in Second Empire architecture, which was popular at the time. It showcased detailed and plentiful decorations, including a domed tower, statues, and an impressive 4-storey high entrance hall. Other buildings in Melbourne were also built in this style at the time and are still around today, including the Hawthorn Town Hall and the General Post Office. Unfortunately though, the Federal Coffee Palace is not one of them. Along with many other coffee palaces and parts of Melbourne at the time, the economic crash and depression of the 1890s brought catastrophic consequences. Many businesses went under, including those of James Monroe, and economic hardship was felt across the country. This forced coffee palaces to either close completely or succumb to applying for liquor licenses to serve alcohol to survive. The Grand Hotel, despite Monroe's defiant stance just 11 years earlier, was forced to start serving liquor in 1897. In the same year, the Federal Coffee Palace applied for and received a license to serve wine, and by 1923 it began serving all types of alcohol. But this was just the first part of their demise. By now, coffee had fallen rapidly in popularity, being replaced by tea as the non-alcoholic beverage of choice, as had happened in Britain many years earlier. This continued to be the case well into the 1950s, when migrants and refugees from Europe reignited the use of coffee in Melbourne and built up the hugely successful coffee culture that we have today. Unfortunately though, this wasn't soon enough for the coffee palaces themselves. Most of them were demolished, mainly in the 1960s and 70s as the city grew. Not even the Federal Coffee Palace could survive the wrecking balls of Wheel and the Wrecker, which knocked it down in 1973. Today, this huge office building stands in its place at 555 Collins Street. Those that survive are few and far between and are mostly located in the suburbs. The Windsor Hotel, despite coming very close to being demolished in the 1970s, still stands today. Other examples include the St Kilda Coffee Palace, the Newport Coffee Palace, and the Grand Coffee Palace in Mornington. Today's tiny holes in the wall and even the largest cafes pale in comparison to these original monuments to coffee. But even though most of the buildings from the first wave of coffee use are lost to time, Melbourne has undoubtedly kept the same enthusiasm and passion that the city had for this drink from over 130 years ago. Thanks for watching. If you enjoyed it and would like to see more, please subscribe to my channel so that you can stay up to date on future videos. Also feel free to check out my website at philipmallis.com. Thanks again, and I'll see you next time.